The hall went silent the way a held breath goes silent, right before he said my name in front of every ranked wolf in the Iron Territories, and dared any one of them to object. I remember the torchlight catching the grey at his temples that hadn't been there a year before. I remember Lord Halrick's hand tightening on the arm of his chair. I remember thinking, with the strange calm that arrives right before everything changes, that I had braided this man's fur in the rain, believing him to be nothing but a hurt animal with nowhere else to go, and here he stood now, offering me a kingdom in front of witnesses who would rather see me dead than crowned. "Say her name again," Halrick said, low and furious. "Say it knowing what it costs you." Varric did not look away from me once. "Eloin," he said, and it landed like a door thrown open in a house that had been shut up for years. That comes later, though. It started on an ordinary, miserable night, with a storm I hadn't planned for, and a wolf I mistook for something smaller than he was. I had gone out past curfew for wet linens left too long on the drying lines behind the laundering house. A fool's errand, Cook would have called it, chasing washing in a storm instead of letting it ruin and starting fresh. But I had nothing spare to replace what I'd lose, and an Omega in this pack learns early that nothing gets replaced without cost. I was hauling in the last sodden sheet when I heard him. Not a howl, a low, ragged sound, half breath and half wound, coming from the tree line at the edge of packland. I found him collapsed half in the mud, enormous even folded in on himself, fur matted black with rain, and something darker at his shoulder that I took, in the dark, for blood. My hands knew what to do before my head caught up to the danger of it. I have spent my whole life tending things too broken to protest the tending. I did not think about whose wolf this was. I thought about the cut, and the cold, and the rain that would kill him faster than any wound if I left him where he lay. I got him under the laundering house eave, out of the worst of it, and worked mud and burrs from fur so tangled it had begun matting into something like rope, talking to him the whole while the way I talk to anything frightened and hurting, low, steady, nothing that needed answering. When I found no wound beneath all that mud, only exhaustion and cold, clear through to the bone, I did not stop tending him. Some hurts don't bleed. I know that better than most. I braided what I could of the worst tangles at his shoulder, working slow so he'd know my hands weren't a threat. And somewhere in that hour, his breathing changed, evened out, deepened. The particular stillness of something that has decided, against its better judgment, to trust. He was gone by the time the storm broke, and dawn came grey through the clouds. I told myself I'd tended a stray, the way I might have tended any pack wolf caught out in weather, and went back to my sodden linens and did not let myself wonder whose eyes those had been, amber even in the dark, watching me like he was memorizing something. He came back the next morning as a man. I knew him the instant he stepped into the laundering yard, because you cannot mistake an alpha king even soaked to the skin and wearing yesterday's mud on his boots. The whole yard went still around him, the way water goes still before something drops into it. I had never stood this close to Varric in 9 years of working this pack. I had certainly never expected him to find me with wet washing in my arms and a look on his face like a man arriving somewhere he hadn't let himself hope existed. "You braided my fur," he said. Not a question. An accounting laid between us like he needed me to look at it plainly. "I didn't know it was you. I know." Something in his jaw worked once before the rest came. "That's rather the point. You tended me like I was worth tending before you knew what I was worth to anyone else. I did not know what to say to that, so I said the only true thing available. You were cold and hurt. I don't need to know a wolf's rank to know that." He looked at me a long moment, rain still dripping from his hair, though the storm had cleared hours before, and I understood, with the particular clarity that comes from watching people my whole life instead of being watched myself, that something in him had cracked open the night before, and he had come back this morning specifically to find out whether it would stay open in daylight. I want to tell you I understood immediately what I was standing in the middle of. I did not. I was an Omega who scrubbed linens for a living, and kings did not return to laundering yards for anyone, and I told myself, walking back inside with my arms full of washing, that he'd simply come to thank a stray kindness and would not come again. He came again the next morning, and the one after that. The law came to me the way it always seems to, attached to something I couldn't set down. Osric, the king's second, found me on the fourth morning, waiting with unhurried patience while Varric finished a low conversation with the laundering house steward that had, I suspected, no real purpose beyond giving him an excuse to linger. "You should know what today is," Osric said, watching his king with the particular fondness of a man who has stood beside him a long time. 5 years ago today, his mother died defending this pack from a border raid his father's council refused to believe was coming. He shifts every year on the anniversary and walks until he can't feel anything, because feeling nothing is easier than feeling that. Last night was the first time in 5 years anyone found him before dawn. I stood very still with a basket of linens against my hip. He didn't tell me that. He wouldn't. He spent 5 years making sure no one has to carry that with him. Osric's gaze flicked to me, considering, "You did though," without being asked. I don't think he knows how to stop coming back to someone who did that. I did not go looking for what happened next. It found me the way true things in my life generally do, quietly, and then all at once. Varric began finding reasons. A torn sleeve that needed mending, though the laundering house did not, strictly, do mending. A question about which herbs took the mud stains from wool, though I suspected he had never once in his life cared about mud stains before me. He would linger in the yard, hands often finding the edge of the drying line post, watching me work with an attention that made my hands unsteady in a way I had stopped pretending was only nerves. "Your court will notice," I told him, on the 7th morning, folding a sheet with more care than it required, so I'd have somewhere to put my eyes. "They already have." He said it plainly, not proudly. Lord Halric mentioned it to me yesterday, in the tone of a man delivering a warning dressed as advice. "And what did you tell him?" "That my wolf found the one person in this pack who tended him without knowing what tending him was worth, and that I did not intend to explain myself for wanting to keep finding reasons to see her." His mouth did something that was almost a smile, the first real one I'd seen on him. He did not care for that answer. I should tell you what I knew of Halric by then, which was what every Omega in the laundering house knew, that he had run this king's council since Varric's father's reign, that his own daughter Rowena had been raised from childhood expecting to be considered for the Luna's seat, and that an advisor with that much invested in a bloodline does not surrender the investment quietly. I had no reason yet to know how far he'd go to protect it. I met Rowena for the first time in the corridor outside the Great Hall, a week later, when Varric had asked me, formally, through Osric, with a courtesy that made the whole laundering house buzz for 2 days, to attend a minor court gathering as his guest. She introduced herself with a smile calibrated precisely to look warm from 3 paces off. "An Omega, invited to court," she said. How generous of him. I imagine it must feel like quite an elevation, coming from the laundering house. "It feels like an invitation," I said. I try not to read more into things than what's actually offered. Wise. Her eyes did not match her mouth. Omegas who read too much into a king's attention tend to find the reading was wishful. I'd hate for you to be disappointed when he remembers what his rank actually requires of him. I did not answer her. I filed the warning away the way I file away a hem that's begun to fray, not urgent yet, but worth watching before it tears in front of someone. If you want to know whether Rowena's warning turned out to be idle court cruelty or something closer to a promise, It was not idle, and what she and her father attempted next put more than my pride at risk. Stay with me. The worst of it is close now, and so is the part where a king stood in front of his entire council and chose to lose something rather than lose me. The vulnerable exchange came 2 weeks later, in the pack's small garden behind the kitchens, the one place in the fortress that still felt like it belonged to no one's rank. He found me there at dusk, and for once neither of us reached for anything to do with our hands. "Ask me something," he said. "Something no one else has dared." I considered it a long moment. Why do you keep coming back to a laundering yard when you could send for anything you wanted instead? Because everything I've ever been sent has come already knowing what I am. You didn't. For one night, in the rain, I was only a hurt thing someone chose to tend, and I have not stopped wanting to be that to you, instead of a crown. His jaw worked once before the rest came, rough and unguarded, in a way I understood. Even then, he did not often let himself be. My mother used to say a king who forgets how to be tended forgets how to rule anyone gently. I forgot for 5 years. You reminded me in a single night, without meaning to. I did not answer with words. I reached over and, for the second time, worked a stubborn tangle at his shoulder loose with careful fingers. Not fur this time, just a knot in the collar of his coat. But he went still under my hands, the exact same way. And I understood the gesture had become its own kind of language between us. That was the night everything in me that had been careful hardened into something closer to certain. The midpoint detonation came from a boy, of all things, a pack orphan named Cade, no older than 7, who had taken to trailing me through the laundering house since his mother died of fever the previous winter, and no one else's rank had time for a child who cried too easily. He found me 3 days after the garden, breathless, having overheard something in the corridor outside the council chamber he'd been told, in no uncertain terms, not to repeat. "Lord Halric wants Papa Varick to marry someone else," he said. Small and furious on my behalf, in the specific way children are furious for people they've decided are theirs. He said the pact only holds if the king's mate is highborn. He said an Omega in the laundering house isn't a mate. She's a mistake he needs corrected before it's written down anywhere official. I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. I had let myself believe, these past weeks, that Varick's attention alone might be enough shield against a council's objections. I understood now, hearing it from a grieving 7-year-old, who had nowhere else to put the information, how naive that belief had been. I did not go to Varick first. I want you to know that. I sat with Cade a long while, letting him cry the way he needed to about a mother the pack hadn't given him time to properly grieve. And something hardened further in me while I held him, a decision the laundering house version of me 3 weeks earlier would not have recognised as her own. I was done being an Omega who let herself be discussed like unfinished paperwork. I found Varick in his study that evening and told him plainly what I knew. "Halric means to have the bond annulled before it's spoken," I said. "Not with a blade, with ink, a council ruling, quiet and procedural, that unmakes this before either of us gets to choose out loud." His face did something I had not seen from him before, not surprise, but the particular stillness of a man confirming a fear he'd been carrying alone. I suspected. I did not know he'd moved already. He crossed the room and took my hands, careful of nothing this time, no distance held between us at all. "I will not let ink undo what a night in the rain started. I give you my word, and I have never given that word lightly to anyone." Halric's second move came 4 days later, and it was not subtle, because subtlety was no longer useful to him. He convened the council formally, invoked the ancient rank clause on record before witnesses, and moved to have the king's household publicly declare the Omega bond void for want of proper standing, a procedural strike meant to end the matter before Varric could claim me in front of anyone who mattered. I stood in that council chamber and did not wait for Varric to answer for me. "Read the clause again," I said, into a room that had not expected a laundering maid to speak at all, not the part your father's advisor quoted, the part above it, about rank and standing, which says a bond is void only if it was never freely chosen by the wolf himself. Mine was. His wolf came to me before either of us knew what the other was. That's not a procedural gap, my lord. That's the entire foundation your clause was built to protect. And you're asking this council to burn it down to keep your daughter's chair warm. Halric's composure did not break outright. But Rowena's did, 2 seats down, in the particular way of someone realizing the ground she'd been promised her whole life had just been pulled out from under her, in front of everyone who mattered. "She's right," Osric said quietly, a copy of the old pact already open in his hands. He had, I learned after, suspected Halric's manoeuvre a week early and simply waited for the moment it would matter most to prove the clause's true wording. The bond stands, freely chosen, on both sides, witnessed by his own wolf's behaviour for a month running. There is no version of this ruling that survives that fact. Halric left the chamber without waiting to be dismissed, which told its own story about how much of that room's confidence he'd actually held to begin with. The grief hit that same night, the way old things do when they've finally been given permission to move. Varric found me in the garden afterward and told me, unprompted, about the raid that took his mother, the details he'd given no one, not even Osric, in 5 years. I did not fill the silences he left. I let him find his own way through them, the same patient stillness I'd learned tending anything too hurt to be rushed. Partway through, something old and cold in him seemed to resist. His hands shook, briefly, gripping the stone bench hard enough that I saw his knuckles whiten, grief surging harder than it had in years all at once, like the wound itself was testing whether he truly meant to let it close. I took his hands in mine and held on, and did not let go, because letting go, in that moment, felt like the one thing I refused to give 5 years of unspoken grief. "You don't have to hold that hard," he said. "Rough, yes," I said, "I do." Whatever had been braced in him for 5 years finally, quietly, let go, not with drama, but the way a held breath finally releases, all at once and then completely. He kissed me there in the garden, careful and unhurried, and I won't tell you every detail of it. I'll tell you it undid something in me that had been braced since a night in the rain when I thought I was tending nothing more than a stray. That's all that belongs to anyone but us. 3 months later, the laundering yard still smelled the same, lye and rain and wet wool. But I stood in it now as something the whole pack had watched named in front of a full court, Cade trailing at my skirts, calling me something halfway between my name and a word he hadn't quite decided applied to me yet, though I suspected, watching his face, that he'd already decided and was simply working up the courage to say it plainly. Halric's council seat had passed, quietly, to a wolf with considerably less appetite for procedural manoeuvring. Rowena had gone to visit distant cousins somewhere that did not require her to watch. Every week, a laundering maid outrank everything she'd been promised her whole life. Varric still finds reasons to linger in the yard some mornings, though he no longer pretends they're about mudstains. I still tend things too broken to protest the tending. An aging hound, a fraying him, a king who once needed someone to sit with him in the rain and never say his name until he was ready to hear it in a crowded hall instead. I braided a stray wolf's fur one miserable night because I had nothing left to give anyone that week except that, and it turned out to be exactly the thing an entire kingdom had been waiting 5 years for someone to offer him. Do you think Varric would have told me about his mother eventually, even without Halric forcing everything into the open? Or did it take losing something to finally let it out? Tell me your theory. And if you want to know what happens to Cade, now that he's got a queen who tends broken things on purpose. Comment the rain and I'll know you're still with me. Come back for the next one. Some kindnesses take longer than a single night to understand what they've started.